creative capital, Chinese garment production in South Africa. It's really a social economic history of a very remote and small place called Newcastle in South Africa, which you can see in the map on the lower right bottom. So Newcastle is basically, in order to help you understand where it is situated, it's at the middle point between Johannesburg and Durban, which is a major port city in South Africa. Although China-Africa is a loosely defined field, some scholars even question whether it's a field of study. But it is undeniable that China-Africa is becoming the fastest growing research areas for scholars from a wide range of disciplines. However, if you follow the news or journalist reports, commentaries, this map is probably a good illustration of your impression about China in Africa. So China now is Africa's largest trading partner, a top investor, and by estimates, there are over 1 million Chinese migrants living and working on the continent. So China just seems to be too overwhelming. In order to better understand China in Africa, I actually wrote a paper a couple of years ago suggesting that we should probably differentiate different layers of China's engagement with Africa. On the top level is a state-to-state engagement, which also usually involves large state-owned enterprises from China. The picture on the left is the famous Tanzania Railway. This is actually a cover of a book by Jamie Monson, which I still consider is the best book in this particular field called China Africa. And the picture on the right is a recently completed mega railway project in Kenya, connecting Mombasa and Nairobi, also constructed with Chinese loan and technology. And on the bottom layer, there are numerous Chinese migrants in Africa. Many are what I call the grassroots adventurists. The picture on the left shows the illegal Chinese gold miners swinging shotguns in their mining camps in Ghana, a country well known for its gold mines for centuries. And in the picture on the right are petty lingerie dealers in Upper Egypt, a very conservative part of the country, where Muslim women would at least cover their heads with scarves, quite a contrast to those sexy and revealing lingerie hanging on the wall. Now today, I would like to show you the significance as well as the complications of the often neglected middle layer of China's engagement with Africa, the small and medium-sized manufacturing companies. So the picture on the left is a shoemaking company, a Chinese company in Ethiopia, in one of those industrial special economic zones. And the picture on the right is a garment factory in Newcastle, which is the subject of my presentation today. So why Newcastle? Now Newcastle is located, as I said, at the middle point between Joburg and Durban, but it's also in the border areas in South Africa. Or if you know a bit of the apartheid history, the border area refers to the area between white South Africa under apartheid and the black homelands. In this particular case, it is the KwaZulu homeland where the Zulu people lived. So it's along that border. It is now South Africa's clothing maker, and it's home to over 100 ethnic Chinese garment factories employing close to 20,000 Zulu women. And during my research, I employed archival methodology. I also conducted oral history research, interview, and also ethnography. And I spent about 12 months in that particular area. While the existing literature on South Africa's border industries offers good explanations of why ethnic Chinese factories came to South Africa, and also offers valid critiques of the border industry as a whole. But no scholars have looked into the nitty-gritties of the business operations of those factories, in this particular case, the diasporic Chinese business community. And no scholars have done detailed studies about the socio-economic impacts on the local Zulu women in those areas. So I will do that hopefully in my own research. So Newcastle during apartheid is a model white border town, economically important for its coal and steel production since the 1960s. However, the Newcastle Town Council adopted its Asian strategy in the early 1980s, and it had transformed the town into a prominent site of low-wage, labor-intensive garment manufacturing, relying upon ethnic Chinese factories and Zulu women workers. After the arrival of its first East Asian clothing company from Hong Kong in 1983, now it has more than 100 and employing a large labor workforce. So this is a large Chinese monument, welcoming monument on the road into Newcastle. In 1995, erection of this landmark was sponsored by Charlie Huang, a very successful business person from Taiwan, and later turned around and became the deputy mayor of that town. This sign not only proclaims the transnational character of the town, the sporadic vandalism on the monument also testifies to the complicated tensions resulting from the arrival of Chinese industrialists. So in one of those attacks, the perpetrator left dozens of leaflets with the words, "Every knee shall bow, every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord," which is a verse from the book of Romans. For Huan and his fellow Chinese, the monument was meant to symbolize their gratitude towards the town and towards the local people, and to suggest and imagine Afro-Asian harmony. But for some local residents, it clearly was not. It was seen as a symbol of foreign domination and industrial exploitation. And my own research will further complicate that. I hope to do so. I'd like to briefly touch two important policies, apartheid policies, that are imperative to the story here today. One was the relocation program for the country's African population since the late 1950s, also known as forced removals. Under this program, Black South Africans were forced to move out of white areas, either into impoverished, overcrowded rural areas or to small separate group areas in the urban regions. In 1971, the apartheid government passed the Bantu Homeland Constitution Act, which empowered the government to grant independence to those homeland. So in theory, Black South Africans would be no longer citizens of South Africa, but citizens of those independent homeland states. According to a very well-known project, it's called the Surplus People Project, conducted by a group of very prominent South African scholars in the early 1980s. There were at least 3.5 million people who were displaced between 1960 and 1983. Now, the second policy was industrial decentralization. This is closely related to the first policy I mentioned. So to ensure that those Black areas were economically viable, the apartheid government introduced a series of border industry programs to encourage industries to relocate to those border regions. And that led to the RIDP program in 1982. The program dated even earlier, but a major shift took place in 1982 with the introduction of the RIDP, Regional Industrial Development Plan. So this new program placed greater emphasis on employment creation in those areas, and a much more generous incentives was designed to reward those industrialists. And one of the biggest subsidies was the reimbursement of up to 95% of the worker's wage. As a result, we see the arrival of many industries, including those I will talk about, the Chinese industries. And the picture on the right gives you a sort of a vivid visualization of what those border industries look like. Basically, if you judge from the pictures, in the middle of nowhere. But in the background, you see those Black residential areas, the removal and relocation Black townships. So in the 1980s, South Africa was facing very severe economic sanctions from the international community. As a response to the mounting international hostility, the apartheid government devised a diplomatic strategy of forging alliances with other so-called parial states, notably Israel and Taiwan. So the economic impact of manufacturing firms from Taiwan and some from Hong Kong in early years was tremendous in the 1980s. According to an industrial census that the Taipei Liaison Office in Pretoria conducted in 1996, the number of Taiwanese firms operating in or near those border areas grew from 35 in 1985 to 620 in 1996. With a total investment of 1.5 billion US dollars. And more importantly, about half of the newly created jobs in those areas in the 1980s was actually from Taiwanese companies. And this is an illustration that shows how South Africa placed its industrial future on foreign investors in the 1980s. At the very center of this block was notably the Taiwanese national flag. And next to it was a colonial flag of Hong Kong. During this race for East Asian investment, Newcastle was much more capable than many of its peers. In that 1996 survey, Newcastle ranked first with 48 Taiwanese factories. And one of the key secrets to Newcastle's success in attracting East Asian investors was its very effective marketing campaign. In fact, Newcastle's city records show that that starting from the mid-1970s, Newcastle had already embarked on a very extensive marketing program to promote the town as a potential industrial site. And this was prompted by ISCO, which is a parastatal steel maker, which is a major industry in the town during the 60s and 70s. After ISCO canceled its second phase expansion in 1976, that's when the government went out to promote the town. City records also show that local officials had learned from both domestic as well as international experiences of how to attract small industries. For instance, they studied the marketing initiatives of Philadelphia in the United States and those of Puerto Rico, as well as domestic examples of Kimberley, which is a city of diamond. And the picture on the left vividly captures Newcastle's promotion strategy. So envisioning a Newcastle-centric world, the Newcastle government highlighted its excellent infrastructure, abundance of cheap labor nearby, and adequate modern facilities. And you can see in this poster, Durban and Johannesburg, Durban is over there, Joburg is here, are the two peripheral reference points in this Newcastle-centric world. Another major promotion strategy that Newcastle adopted was to work with business consultancies. For instance, Nikki Kwan, the first woman from left in the picture, who had been the general manager of Newcastle's first East Asian garment firm, was appointed as a town council's consultant in 1988 in Hong Kong. So long story short, as a result, between 1988 and 1992, Newcastle witnessed a rapid increase of ethnic Chinese industries. City records show that every month, at least one Taiwanese or Hong Kongese company invested in the town during that period, 1988 to 1992. Now, after the South African government substantially reduced its incentives for those industries in 1992, investment from Taiwan and Hong Kong slowed down. But in Newcastle and KwaZulu-Natal more generally, KwaZulu-Natal is a province where Newcastle is now situated. There was a renewed excitement during the late 1990s as officials in the government believed that mainland China, especially its state-owned enterprises, would invigorate the region with large amounts of manufacturing investment. However, to the disappointment of many, most investment from Chinese state-owned enterprises turned out to be short-lived. Well, time today doesn't allow me to give you a full account why these early investments failed, but the subsequent growth of Newcastle's garment industry was by and large an endogenous process, or what you might call it a cascading effect, resulting from its existing Chinese garment factories. Scholars often treat ethnic Chinese factories in the border areas as a unitary term or a black box because of lack of access or data. In my own research, I distinguish three different types of ethnic Chinese family clothing firms. Well, all of them are family businesses, but there are three major types. First is what I call the exporters. These are big garment producers, mainly from Hong Kong and Singapore, who usually took international orders. They are responsible for purchasing the fabric and other raw materials, and they work on large production scale, employing between 1,000 and 2,000 workers each. Newcastle used to have 4 of such companies, but they all left by mid-2000s. The second subgroup, or the second type, were the Taiwanese knitting firms. They are predominantly small to medium-sized family businesses. The work in a knitwear firm can be roughly divided into 2 phases. The male members of the family often work on the first phase, in which yarn is woven into knitted fabric, and the female members would take over the second phase, in which the fabric is turned into the final items. An average knitwear firm in Newcastle employs 30 to 50 people. Now there are about 30 of them in Newcastle today. Finally, there are the mainland Chinese CMT firms, or the cut, make, and trim firms in Chinese 代工厂. These firms were recently established beginning from the mid-2000s and have 2 distinctive features, which will be the subject, a big part of my presentation today. They rely primarily on CMT work, only take domestic orders, and with the CMT order, the supplier, which is the buying agent, provides all the fabric requirements for quality and style, and the payment once the order is completed. So the firm itself doesn't bear much monetary pressure, but simply gets paid for the sewing work. The second feature is that these companies or producers represent a radical form of family business. A mainland Chinese CMT firm is often a joint venture of 2 partners who are in a very stable boyfriend-girlfriend relationship, which is recognized and respected among the business community. Usually the 2 partners both have spouses and families back in China, but decided to form what I call a production couple relationship for the sake of business success abroad. Despite the openness of the production couple relationships, direct conversations about their existence and with it their numbers are difficult. In many ways, they are open secrets, accepted but not necessarily discussed. Yet, I was able to undertake a small survey in one of the industrial areas in Newcastle, and according to that survey, 11 out of 18 clothing firms, or 61%, were built on such partnerships. And my hunch is that the overall rate is actually much higher, probably close to 70, even over. There are 2 main reasons for this seemingly strange but prevalent partnership arrangement. First is a structural reason from a business perspective. Now, if you go into a CMT firm or a clothing firm, you would notice that 2 people are very important for their business operation. Now, the production line supervisor, who usually is a female, is responsible for pipelining received work order and give sewing instructions to the workers. And then was the mechanic, typically a male, who maintains and services the machinery. So if the line supervisor and the mechanic have acquired skills in general management or order taking, they can immediately form their own partnership and start a new business. And this explains the rise or the rapid proliferation of CMT firms from the mid-2000s. Now, second reason was a historical one. While Taiwanese and the Hong Kongese industrialists were invited by the South African or the apartheid government in the 1980s with substantial incentives, these Chinese, mainland Chinese, were recruited by those Taiwanese and Hong Kongese industrialists in the beginning. For the Taiwanese and Hong Kongese, the earlier industrialists, incentives included, among others, housing subsidies and generous approval for permanent residency or South African citizenship, which made it much easier to relocate as a family. But these are not available to those mainland Chinese who were recruited by those factories. Now, we have to remember that Chinese in Newcastle is a small community. For instance, at a banquet or party, the boyfriend and girlfriend would sit together, get introduced together, and receive toasts as if they were a married couple. But in private, local Chinese call such relationships as some of the no Chinese 野夫妻, or in English, undomesticated couple. These undomesticated couples are openly recognized, as I said, and in theory do not allow for infidelity or affairs outside the relationship, and therefore can be very stable. By compressing themselves in such partnerships, these Chinese men and women are able to participate in social interactions and to cultivate family business networks with other producers, which are so crucial to their business success. Now, let's look at the workers. We have to remember that Black South African, mostly, especially women, Black South African women had been largely excluded from wage labor until the 1960s. And traditionally, under the migrancy system beginning from the late 19th century in South Africa or in Southern Africa, the typical Black South African woman was a mother figure in this poster on the left, pointing at the distant mining compounds, the gold mining compounds, usually in the cities, telling her husband and sons to go and work and make the money and bring the money back and to marry more wives. However, it is interesting to note the gender component in the picture from the 1980s on the right. The Zulu man in blue was portrayed as holding machine tools in his hand with smokestacks in the rural background, the border areas. A very typical image that people would have about South African industries, heavy industries usually. The Black woman in pink and white was put forth to showcase a new face of the country's industrial future. Shoes, fabrics, other light manufacturing would be at the core of the country's, especially the homeland's, industrial development. Now, this is a picture of the shop floor of one Chinese clothing factory in Newcastle. And you can see that many of those women are not factory girls, which we usually associate with textile and garment factories, factory girls in their late teens or early 20s. These are women, many of them are in their 30s, 40s, and 50s, and they work under harsh conditions. It is quite revealing that local township residents refer to factory workers as Mama Mabodini, which is a isiZulu word. And in isiZulu, Mama means mother, mothers, and body means advertising board or advertising plate. So older informants remember that people initially called the industrial area where the factories are Amabodi because of its many advertising plates. Given the predominance of Chinese garment firms in this area, Mama Mabodini essentially means factory mothers who are working in the Chinese factories. And the reference to factory women as mothers is an indication of respect in the local culture, but also reveals that most factory workers are, in fact, single and unmarried mothers, or even grandmothers. I have spoken to over 100 women workers, mostly Zulu women, and have done 45 extended interviews. Among the 45, only 6 are married. Now, Zulu factory mothers now rely increasingly on what I call the female linked. Can I go back? Sorry, it's supposed to be this picture. So the picture shows Tulisili, the female linked families. This picture shows Tulisili, which is a grandma in this picture, a 54-year-old Zulu woman, originally from Ngoma, which is the heartland of the Zululand in South Africa, who came to Newcastle in 1984 for jobs in the factory. She is the sole breadwinner of the household, consisting of 4. Her youngest son, I think who's taking the picture, her daughter and her daughter's child, and herself. The household relied on the mutual support between Tulisili and her daughter. Like many of her peers, Tulisili also participated in stock fairs, the Women's Communal Savings Group, which I don't have time to touch today. What I like to highlight is we have to remember that Chinese firms came to South Africa in a particular conjunction in history. Now, on the one hand, retrenchments in industrial jobs in South Africa, especially since the mid-1970s, resulted in appalling levels of unemployment across the country, especially for black men, and subsequently led to what many historians call the decline of the African family. Unable to gain access to jobs, as many of their fathers and grandfathers could with the migrancy labor system, unemployed black men since then had become not only the so-called underclass of the society, but also unwanted spouses as well. On the other hand, coincidentally, the 1970s and early 1980s was also a historic time in South African history when black women entered the factory floor in large numbers, and many worked for the ethnic Chinese firms. Now let me end again with this monument. I think it serves as a perfect window to gesture three broad trends about Africa, China, and as the golden arches in the background suggest global capital, which I used in the title of this presentation. First, unlike traditional immigrant groups in Africa, for example, the Lebanese in West Africa, the Indians or South Asians in East Africa, the Chinese in Newcastle constitute an emerging industrial diaspora. While Newcastle's, because the Lebanese and the Indians mostly are trading diaspora, they do trade and commerce. While Newcastle's marketing campaigns and the availability of incentives and cheap female workers had attracted ethnic Chinese entrepreneurs in the very beginning, the subsequent growth and evolution of these foreign industries derived as much from national and global socio-economic conditions as from their internal diasporic dynamics. Second, my research shows the making of Zulu factory mothers, or Mama Mabodini. As they sold fabric items on the shop floor of the Chinese factories, Mama Mabodini at the same time crafted in townships a new type of black female respectability and or African motherhood. Newcastle's Zulu factory mothers had developed a more organic understanding of the relationship between sexuality and accumulation. Across the African continent, black women often achieved accumulation and autonomy by spinning off domesticity and sexuality, for example, through serving as domestic helpers, operating illicit shebeens or the breweries, working as prostitute. I can go on with examples, basically providing the comforts of home, using one scholar's term. The accumulation of Mama Mabodini, or the Zulu factory mothers, however, was not rooted in or contingent upon their female sexuality. Scholars often discuss black female respectability in the context of Christian ideologies, modern education, and notions of middle-class propriety, which centered marriage as a defining constituent of proper womanhood. The novelty of Newcastle's Zulu factory mothers was that they forged a new form of black female respectability and motherhood, which transcends female sexuality in this context, and without significant male presence in the household. Finally, it is about capital on the edge. My presentation title, Age of Capital, has a threefold purposes. First of all, it refers to the distant geographical location or the frontier, that is the border area in this context. Second, it refers to the time frontier of a particular apartheid moment, although my story extends to the present time, but it all started in a time where the apartheid government had difficulties attracting investment to those areas. Finally, it refers to the peripheral nature of my chosen participants. Chinese small family firms represent one of the most flexible forms of capitalist productions or capitalist enterprises. They are not the rule makers, globally speaking, and they survive and compete on the very low-end segment of global manufacturing. Zulu factory mothers, on the other hand, as black and women, are on the lowest run of the global labor hierarchy. They are the newest and perhaps the last entrants to modern factories. This research reveals to us a non-dichotomous relationship between capital and culture, showing how the social and cultural construction of gender and family is very inherent to how capitalism, or especially in this case, industrial capital, works. In particular, I refuse to take an essentialist and static interpretation of family. Rather, I highlight the centrality as well as the fluidity of family in industrializing societies. Although scholars have long demonstrated the changing modalities or changing forms of the capitalist family, this research contributes to this scholarship in two significant ways. First, it shows how industrial capitalism relied on the fractured family, both for the labor supply, mama mabodini, and for the provision of the capitalists, the production couples. So this research reveals the complicated processes in which the industrializing age in Southern Africa has torn apart existing family structures and remolded them into units far afield from the nuclear family structure or pattern, which we often associate with industrial societies, modern industrial society. Second, regarding the regional literature on the Zulu family, this research shows how the extended and the female-linked family structure facilitated late industrial production. While scholars noticed that the industrial decline since the mid-1970s in South Africa had led to the breakdown of the African family, they overlooked how the transformation of the home further provided the foundation for the low-wage, labor-intensive, and women-oriented light manufacturing. The ethnic Chinese production couple and the Zulu female-linked family are essentially both capitalist families that not only smoothed the way for intensified production, but also facilitated accumulation for both parties, both the industrialists and the Zulu women. So this research finally shows that Chinese diasporic industrialists and Zulu factory mothers are not passive products of that capital frontier, but active shapers of that frontier. Now to conclude, Newcastle, although perhaps unique in the world due to its apartheid history and its strong linkage to East Asia, might be the world that we will increasingly witness on the frontiers of capitalist production. In a larger sense, as fragmented factories and fractured families become more prevalent and central to how late industrial capitalism works, female respectability and women's solidarity, especially among the laboring poor, will only grow in prominence in many places like Newcastle in the world. That's my presentation. Thank you.